wonderful day. I know I am. Today I'm back with another interview. Meanwhile, because we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and today I'm actually talking about a topic that a viewer requested. I do not remember your username, so I'm sorry, but if you commented here, your video request. They wanted to know about communication. So, Makiana, I know I have, and you all have seen him a million times. Teddy, he always wanted to use him, you know. And his aunt, Rebecca, is home. So, today we are going to be talking about communication. So, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. My name is Rebecca Goldman, and I'm a speech language pathologist. I graduated from a graduate school program at St. Louis University in 1998. So I guess that puts me at practicing for about 22 years. Yeah. And going on 23 years. And I grew up in St. Louis and went to undergraduate at University of Vermont, and then ended up back in St. Louis for graduate school, and I am now living down in Orlando, Florida.
Nice. Yeah, that must be nice. Now we have about an episode on demand right now.
Yeah, it's yeah, that's nice for you guys.
So anyway, my first question is, I know you are a pathologist. Can you explain what that is for people that may not know?
Sure. A speech language pathologist is someone who can work with babies all the way through geriatrics, and they work on receptive language, expressive language, and speech. To define those terms, receptive language is what you understand. So if someone is having a difficult time processing or understanding information, that's something that a speech language pathologist can work on. They work on expressive language. Before I define that, it's actually easier. I'll start with the speech. So speech, I think, is what people understand. It's what you hear as a listener, what comes out of somebody's mouth, and how they make the sounds, and how they pronounce words. Expressive language is looking at what they're saying. So not the how they're saying, but what they're saying. So how people are able to put sentences together, how they're able to pull the vocabulary words they want, how they use language, their pragmatic skills, so social language. So that falls into that realm. And speech language pathologists can also work on feeding skills. So someone, whether it's a baby or someone who's had a stroke, or someone's later on in life who has difficulty with feeding and swallowing, that's something that a speech language pathologist can work on as well. So there's a wide range of things that a speech pathologist can do.
Definitely. And for those who are new to my channel, I have a party, and I did teach all the way up till my freshman year of high school. So that could work on my sound and my pronunciation and stuff like that. So if you're wondering how that affects me, I will actually be going on my YouTube channel to highlight talking about my story. So stay tuned to that. Manette, can you explain your journey or inspiration for becoming a speech language pathologist?
Yes, I would be happy to. I started off in speech therapy, actually, kind of looking back in elementary school. I had a hard time saying my R's. And of course, at the time, my name was Rebecca Mois. So there's always in your name, it's Murphy's Law that you're going to, if you have difficulty pronouncing a sound, it is going to be in your name. So I remember going into a room by myself with a woman and working on R's. But that didn't inspire me to go down this path, actually. I knew that I wanted to teach in some capacity, but even as I was getting into college, I knew I didn't want to be like a third grade classroom teacher. I knew I didn't want to be like a regular classroom teacher. I wanted to do something, and I wasn't quite sure how to do it. I didn't know how to teach something if you weren't just like an elementary school teacher. So I got a degree in human development and family studies, which is in the School of Education, and it was a people degree. I got to learn about families and interactions, and it was a good kind of base. And in my second semester of my senior year, I took a class called English as a Second Language. So it was, teaching you how to work with someone who didn't have English as their second language. And there was someone who came from the Communication Sciences and Disorders department at the university at Vermont. And she was a speech language pathologist, and she was talking about how you put your tongue in a certain place to say the R or say the T or the S. And that really interested me. And I used some of those skills she talked about when I was working with my student in class for this English as a Second Language class. I had a student from China. He was a graduate student, and he wanted to work on his R's. And so I used some of those strategies, and I thought, and it worked. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. But I was a second semester senior. I was not going to sign up for another 3 years of undergraduate to get an undergraduate in communication sciences and disorders, particularly because you do need a master's degree to be a speech language pathologist. So I graduated. I taught environmental education for a couple of years up in New England at a program called Nature's Classroom. And during those years that I was working there, I came across a parent of one of the kids who just kind of came along, and she happened to be a speech language pathologist. So I was talking to her about that career, and I thought, that is what I want to do. You can work with small groups of children. And at the time, I was only interested in working with children. I had no interest in working with adults. But I thought, okay, well, this is what I want to do. You can work in the schools, you can work in hospitals, you can work in people's homes, you can go to daycares, all these, different places you can work. And the beauty of it is you can change throughout your career. You can, one year you could work with preschoolers, and then you could work with high schoolers. And so that really interested me. So I started talking to professors in departments. I visited with someone at Georgetown. I talked to the professor at University of Vermont, and to kind of figure out what I would need to do, because there is an undergraduate degree in it. So I decided that, so I, in talking to people, and I thought, well, this is definitely what I wanted to do. And I did have to take some, what was called post-baccalaureate classes. So there were some classes that I missed as an undergraduate that I needed to go to graduate school. So I did that in New Mexico and in Minnesota. I kind of traveled around a lot in my 20s. And then when it came time to apply to graduate schools, I ended up accepting at St. Louis University and kind of going back home, and spent 2 years there in a fabulous program. And it just clicked. I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And, classes were easy for me because it just made sense for me. I loved the practical and the clinical work. And I decided not to pursue a PhD because I really wanted to work with clients and felt, that you didn't need a PhD for that. So I was happy with my master's and graduated. And as soon as I graduated, was offered a job at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where I had done a clinical internship during graduate school. And that's where my career started. So it was a little roundabout, but I eventually got there.
Amazing. And yeah, I think people who want in education or anyone with need, they have a deeper, you definitely build deeper connections, I think, more so than working in hold on, so I hate using this word, but normal, happen. I know for me, a lot of my friends in high school had autism and, under Down syndrome and McMillan Rett syndrome, and you could build already relationships that you wouldn't have had if you were not pursuing, Hesper Ed or, anything that was Professor D. These people are amazing.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I did look at special ed to go in to get that degree, but what appealed to me about speech language pathology was the flexibility of the career. You could work part-time, you could work 2 hours, you could have a private practice, you could work at a school, you could work with adults. So I have worked with a lot of special education teachers and respect them tremendously. And but this was kind of the better fit for me, because I knew I wanted to get married and have kids, and I knew that I didn't want to work full time. And so I thought that this would be a career where it would give me some flexibility, and it absolutely has. When I was a new mom, I started literally working 1 day a week. I had one client. And that's like all I needed to get out of the house and kind of keep my brain working. And then, you kind of build from there. But it's, so I've literally worked 1 hour a week up to, full time. So.
Wow. Interesting. Okay, my next question is, who does I think, oh, my iPad is going on. Who does I think the name help? And what are the benefits of enrolling your child in speech?
Okay, I touched about this a little bit earlier, but speech pathologists can work in the NICU, in children's hospitals with 24-week-old preemies, all the way through, geriatrics, nursing homes, Alzheimer's, so it's the wide spectrum. In terms of the benefits are that a speech language pathologist can help an individual communicate better. They can help them increase their ability to be understood by other people, as well as how they understand things. And as I mentioned, it can also help with feeding and eating.
Definitely. And I think, well, I don't think, I know that most people, when they see someone with a disability, including myself, they automatically assume that you can't communicate. And that's totally wrong, because when someone doesn't understand me or anything like that, or when someone doesn't directly speak to me and talk to whoever I'm with, I will automatically, butt in and just start talking to myself. Or if they don't understand me, I will literally pull out my iPhone and start typing, start texting them, and be like, here's what I'm trying to tell you. Or at school, when I was working on a milk product and they didn't understand me, I would literally pull up a document on my computer. So don't assume that people can't communicate, because that's your bad if you assume that.
That's right. There's a lot of assumptions, from people out there. And I think it kind of works both ways. Someone in your situation, Anna, someone will see you, they see your disability, right? It's a visual disability. And then they have certain assumptions. Oh, maybe she can't understand things. Maybe she's not smart. Maybe she can't communicate. But then you also have the situation where you have someone who's walking and talking, but they have a severe disability in terms of what they can understand and how they communicate. So that's challenging. So that's one kind of barrier in terms of a public announcement to not make assumptions about people by the way they look, which of course is, what we're working on as a civilization.
Yeah, and that's what my YouTube channel and my brand is trying to do. So, yeah. I know that there are different ways of communication. iPad communication app, ASL modified sign, communication devices, and more. can you talk a little bit about a way the communication type and how someone can best use them or accommodate someone who uses these ways of communication?
Right. So kind of what you're talking about is alternative or augmentative communication, AAC, which, you know, obviously there's many different ways to communicate. You've got oral communication, which is what we're doing right now. And sometimes that falls apart depending on who the communication partners are. And so you have that. You have American Sign Language, ASL, that you mentioned, and that only works if both people know ASL, right?
Right.
So it's a wonderful way to communicate if everybody who's trying to communicate uses ASL, but it doesn't work all the time if you need to communicate with people who don't use ASL. And then you get into the alternative and augmentative communication devices. And it has been the past 20 years since I was in graduate school, this is the field I feel like that has really changed the most, I should say, because it's technology based. So when in graduate school, when we were learning about this, there were certain dedicated devices used as communication devices. And they were something as, you know, maybe as simple as a one push button that you could record something in, you know, that says, hi, my name is Rebecca. And so the person could push their button and say, hi, my name is Rebecca. And so something basic like that, that goes all the way through to a, you know, complex computer that needs to be programmed into what people, you know, want to say. And then also there's just paper and pencil, which, so if you have someone who can't speak, but they can write, you know, that's sometimes the quickest way to do that. I think a lot of people, when you're looking at technology, they want to look at technology, iPads and computers and whatever, but sometimes the basics works the best. And so something even as simple as having a piece of paper with a yes, no on either side of the piece of paper, or a smiley face or a frowny face. And so if you have someone, I don't even know if you can see that very well,
Yep.
but it's something just as basic as this. So if you're talking to someone and they can point and you can say, do you want to eat? They can just point and say yes. And so something even as, I don't want to say basic, because having a yes, no response is huge. So I'm not going to say it's basic, but something low tech. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yep.
Something low tech. And so when you're looking at someone who needs assistance with communication, maybe it's somebody who can use oral communications most of the time or sometimes, but sometimes communication kind of falls apart, like you were just describing, Anna. You give a perfect example of that. So you have a backup. And I have used things like index cards on a little ring that's got some basic responses, you know, your name and yes, no, and favorite foods, and I need to go to the bathroom, and I'm thirsty, and some things like that. So the person can just kind of pull those out quick and use those. And having a backup, you know, iPhone and iPad obviously is very helpful. But when you assess somebody for a communication device, it's important to look at what they're able to do. If you give a complex device that uses little tiny buttons that you need to push, and it's somebody who doesn't have the fine motor skills for that, it's not a good device for them. Or someone who maybe does have some cognitive issues and has, you know, just has difficulty with that. If you give them a complex device, that can be challenging and not used then. So you want to make sure, and a speech language pathologist can certainly do that and kind of assess what device or what modality is going to be best for that person. And sometimes it's a combination, as you described.
Yeah.
And so that's, you know, that's very important. What's another piece is their communication partners and their support at home. You know, there are certainly situations where, you know, a person is evaluated on a device and it's going to be a good fit, and they get it through insurance, and it's, you know, it's a huge, long process. but it's all set up. And then if they don't have somebody in the home or at school who's going to pull that device out and have them have access to it, then that's not going to work either. So you kind of need to look at the whole picture of the person you're evaluating to make sure it's going to be a good fit. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And I know that one that you can operate with your eye. That would really use too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty cool.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. If you know, because all you need is something consistent, whether it's an eye blink or a flick of a finger or whatever it is, you can use that. It can be, you know, something that's seemingly very, very minimal, but if it's something that's intentional that the person can do, however small it may seem, it can really open up the world to them.
Definitely, and I know that a lot of people, because I have them doing all different forms of communication, and then I have people who don't meeting me for the first time and don't really understand the things I'm saying, so I have to help them by using an alternative. And often I have people who know me for a while, but I might be talking about a topic that I don't normally talk about with that person. With Teddy and I and Allie have a little time where I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm like, someone put out your phone and I'll contact you. And Penny's like, okay, I bought you.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's very important that you have a backup plan.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. Oftentimes I'm asked due to my speech impairment, what do I do when someone can't understand me? Do you have any tips for people who may have speech impairment and sometimes struggle to be understood? Or on the other hand, have any tips for people who have a friend or family member with a speech impairment and have difficulty understanding them?
Right. Well, this is really important. I'm so glad that you asked this because
yeah, my subscriber actually asked it.
Yeah, and honestly, I have been in situations before where I feel like I want to do a talk on, you know, something along the lines like how to talk to someone who can't talk, or how to talk to someone who has difficulty talking, because a lot of times, especially, you know, kind of in the older population, you may have a friend who had a stroke and, you know, they can no longer speak. You know, how do you keep that friendship going? And it's so important, you know, for everyone to keep those friendships going. So to start off, for tips for the speaker, I think starting off and saying and communicating whatever way, whether it be just a card to hold up or whatever it is, but to tell the listener that they're going to need to be patient, that you need extra time to, you know, to get your point across. Someone who uses a computer to talk, as fabulous as that is, there's a delay. It's not as efficient as, you know, how I'm speaking. So the listener needs to be patient. And sometimes that's hard for people, but it's important to be an advocate and tell people that, hey, this is going to take a little longer, so just bear, you know, bear with me.
Yeah.
To do this. And then another thing is to try to use, you know, if you know that you have some sounds you have a hard time saying, you know, try to use other words that are going to help get your point across. Obviously, this would be in a situation with someone who maybe you're just coming in contact with once or twice, someone at the grocery store or something like that, where, you know, they're not going to get to know you, they're not going to know your habits and patterns, you know, something like that. And there's just real quickly, I don't know if you saw the inauguration, but the poet who read her beautiful poem and so eloquently, had a speech impairment. I heard an interview with her on NPR the day before the inauguration, and I figured it was stuttering, and she said, yes, usually people assume it's going to be stuttering, but she, just had an articulation impairment. There were some sounds she had a hard time saying. And that's actually, she said, why she became a poet, because as a 4 or 5-year-old, she just couldn't communicate verbally what she wanted to. And so she would write poems to communicate what she was feeling. And as she got older and her poetry kind of got on and people asked her to, read her poems, she would have to scramble kind of at the last minute and change words because she couldn't say them well. And one of the sounds she had a hard time saying was R, and she's 22, and she said she was working on this until she was 20, that she couldn't say her R's. And so if she wanted to say girls rule the world, well, she was not going to be able to say that in her poem. And so she had to change the words to be able to do it. And I think that is, there's a good lesson for all of us in that there's going to be certain things we have a hard time communicating, and just to kind of have something in our head that's going to be easy for our listener to hear. So that's, in terms of the tips for speakers. And then also, as I kind of mentioned, have cards of frequently used words, and also just to say, or a card that says, ask me yes, no questions, because maybe, the person has a good yes, no response. And sometimes that's easier to answer and to be understood. So that's, another tip that I've used with people. And then in terms of, you listeners out there who have someone in your life who has difficulty communicating, be a patient listener. And be honest. If you don't understand something that they're saying, ask them to repeat it, because you get in trouble if you just nod, oh, and then all of a sudden you feel free to drive cross country with them. You had no idea. So it's important, to be honest, and also to use those yes, no questions when possible. It doesn't always work, and there obviously sometimes you want more information from someone, but if it's a quicker interaction, to phrase your questions in yes, no, is an easier way to answer. And also, obviously, that to kind of take a step back, you need to have established with that person what their yes, no response is, whether they can physically say yes or no, whether they have cards that they use to, point to that say yes or no. I've used, fists before, like this is yes and this is no, and then the person just has to look that way or point that way to be able to answer the yes, no questions. And that is a quick and dirty, efficient way to kind of get some basic information.
Yeah, and when you ask if you understand the person and you don't, the personal experience, that's really aggravating to the person, because that is not what they said, and you can tell, at least for me, I can tell when the person doesn't understand me, and I'm like, why did you say you didn't understand me? Because if you're trying to dictate how to take care of your own self or how they take care of you, it can be really frustrating if you have to go backwards because the person was trying to be polite and ask me to understand them.
That's right. And I think you addressed a good point about being polite. And, I mean, my husband and I are proficient communicators, but we misunderstand each other all the time. I mean, not all the time, but a lot of times, just the intent of things. And so, and so I'll say, what did you mean by that? I didn't quite follow that. Or could you repeat that? So that's okay. I mean, that's a natural part of communication, is that you're not going to quite get the whole idea. And it's fine to ask for clarification.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll even call the person out. I'll be like, you didn't understand me, did you?
Right, no, that's good. And I applaud you for that. And you have a good humor about you, and put the person at ease about it. But that's important. I think.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Do you have a name with Halloween story where he has improved a time right?
You know, I think about that poet who read her poem at the inauguration, and she probably has had a whole line of speech language pathologists behind her. And whoever this last one was that finally got that R, you know, helping her with her R, I think about her when you ask that question. Yeah, I mean, that would be a big thing, that your students spoke, read her poems at the, at presidential inauguration. So I don't have a big story like that, but I will say I'm very fortunate in that I really feel like I chose a career where I impact a lot of people. And I, think back at all the clients and their families that I had the honor and opportunity to work with. And, I like to think that I helped them and, to be better communicators or whatever it is they came to see me for. So honestly, I can't think of a single person that, kind of really, stands out that big, oh yeah, the Lin-Manuel, I worked with him when he was younger and helped him, like I don't have a big star, behind me, but that, that's okay. I'm happy.
Yeah.
I'm just so honored with the people that I was able to help. I can think about this one girl. She was a second grader and she had a lisp and she was really into theater and she wanted to be able to perform. And so she kind of went to her mom and said, I have this lisp. I want to get rid of it. I want to be able to be on stage and I want to act and I want to get rid of this lisp. So she was very motivated and I worked with her. And most people, when they get started with me, one of the first questions is, well, how long is this going to take? And of course, you just don't know.
No.
But this girl, she remedied her lisp in 6 weeks, which was like, I couldn't believe it. But it wasn't so severe, and she was very motivated, and she understood, and she practiced, and she kind of took off with it. Now I've worked with lots of other people who were motivated and understood and all those things, and it took them longer. But she kind of stands out because she was someone who, kind of a story that I don't even like to tell because it's kind of unheard of, but that was kind of neat. And then I guess the other story is, my sons, Sammy and Joseph, both used communication devices. They used computers to talk, and the freedom and the independence that gave them to have a voice, was astounding. And for Joseph, he was able to use his communication device to be able to go through the Jewish milestone of becoming a bar mitzvah. And for those of you who don't know what that is, when Jewish boys and girls are 13, they turn into young men and women, and they have they participate in services in their temple or synagogue, and you need to, and Joseph was able to use his communication device to be able to participate in the readings and the blessings and the songs, and that was a great source of pride for him. And so I think about, had he not had access to that, or he was able to use his finger, and so he was able to physically access it, but that was really an important part of his life.
Definitely. I was reading, for my book club, I'm reading Out of My Mind. You read that book? I'll have to send it to you. But it's about this bird named Melody who had cerebral palsy and cannot communicate. And he has no devices or anything like that. So she's stuck inside her head. So yeah, a communication device really helps an individual be able to make their own daily choices, what you want for breakfast or what you want to wear that day. Even those little things that we all take man, if people didn't have communication devices, we'd all be tuning for them and probably making the wrong decisions.
That's right. Because we're not, people are not mind readers.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And my last question is, what's your biggest advice for families thinking about enrolling or have a must-one in STEAM?
Well, I learned this a little bit later in my career, but people are not broken. They do not need to be fixed. But at the same time, if someone is having trouble in math, you're going to get them a tutor to help them along and learn the skills they need to learn. And I think about speech in that same way, that people do not need fixing, but if they have difficulty communicating and they want to be able to communicate, then they need to have a tutor. They need to get a little help to put, to move them along, give them the skills that they need to be able to communicate. And I remember in graduate school, there was a woman who came to speak in one of the classes, and she had had a stroke, and in the hours and days right after the stroke, she couldn't walk and she couldn't talk. And she said, as she was lying in bed, and all she prayed for was that she would be able to talk again. She didn't care about walking again. She didn't care about using her arms again. She just wanted to be able to communicate with people again. That was most important to her. And she pretty much recovered fully. Both, her, she was able to walk again and learned and was able to talk again. But that community, that really affected me, that communication is powerful. I mean, powerful for a person to be able to communicate with people, and important. And so if you're in a situation to be able to help provide help to somebody who needs some help communicating, then it's certainly worth doing. And you kind of mentioned kids, but this is on the other end of the spectrum. This is the same, for adults, and I talked about, for feeding, and if you have someone who has Alzheimer's, but they love fooding, and their food and their passion in life was, food and eating, then, getting them help to, swallowing therapy to be able to continue to enjoy that is, something to look into. And that's where having, people in your life, doctors and, and people to ask for services is important.
Definitely, I agree. So if you like this video, you should know what to do by now, but like this video by hitting the like button and subscribe if you're new. We are at like 534, and I'd love to add for my family. Comment down below with any questions or video requests. And I will see you in my next video. I'm gonna